Last week I was out. Derek taught what I heard was a stellar lesson. But the 2 weeks before that, we started going through a couple of Psalms. And specifically, we're talking about the impact that worship has on various aspects of our lives. The first week, we talked about the impact that worship has on our walks. We saw that a man who is grounded in God, who is consistently praising, is firmly planted. The analogy, the word picture that was used was a tree planted by a stream of water. It's very strong, well nourished. It's not going to be moved. The opposite of that, a man who is, or a person who is not in worship, who's not grounded in God, is compared to chaff, that the outer husk of wheat that blows away at the slightest puff of wind. We then went on to notice that worship empowers and it charges our walks. When we looked at the specific Psalms that week, we saw that David is calling out the great characteristics of God. He's getting himself more excited, and as a result, he was capable of greater things because of worship. When you take fear out of the equation, and when you realize the great power that you have the ability to tap into, you dare more greatly in your walk. We also talked about worship in our highs and in our lows. That was week 2, and we saw that when David was at a personal high versus when David was at a personal low, a lot of the things that he was praising God for, the way he praised God, the things that he called out, the characteristics that he showcased in those Psalms were pretty much the same regardless of where he was. And with somebody who's on a high or a low, they could be high or they could be low, they could be somewhere in between. But in that situation, there's one thing that does not change, and that's God, that's God's nature, and that's truths about his nature. By praising him, we recognize the truth of the situation, the constant, unchanging nature of God, and that brings us closer to the truth and helps us basically work through our emotions in this. So by praising him, we draw closer to him. And this week, we're going to talk about worship in spiritual warfare. Jesus warned the disciples in John chapter 15, verse 18, that the world hated him. Later, the world would go on to kill him and revile him. Therefore, they are not to be surprised if the world hates them, and by extension, us as members of the church. Because they hated our head, because they hated our founder, they're going to hate us. And in this series, most of the Psalms that we have read through have dealt with David coming under attack from his enemies. Thus far, we've focused on basically his feelings on the matter and how he's responded to handling those feelings. But this week, we're going to talk about how he directly responds to spiritual attacks. And if you read Ephesians chapter 6, it talks about putting on the full armor of God. You put on armor because you're about to go fight in a battle. You don't put it on just for kicks and giggles unless it's October 31st. Then it's okay. But what role does worship play in spiritual warfare? So if everyone would turn to Psalm chapter 144, we're going to read verses 1 through 11. Would somebody mind doing that for us?
Blessed be the Lord, my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. He is my steadfast love and my fortress, my stronghold and my deliverer, my shield and he in whom I take refuge, who subdues peoples under me. O Lord, what is man that you regard him, or the son of man that you think of him? Man is like a breath, his days are like a passing shadow. Bow your heavens, O Lord, and come down. Touch the mountains so that they smoke. Flash forth the lightning and scatter them. Send out your arrows and rout them. Stretch out your hand from on high. Rescue me and deliver me from the many waters, from the hand of foreigners. For those whose mouths speak lies and whose right hand is the hand of falsehood. I will sing a new song to you, O God. Upon a 10-string harp I will play to you, who gives victory to kings, who rescues David, his servant, from the cruel sword. Rescue me and deliver me from the hand of foreigners, whose mouths speak lies and whose right hand is a right hand of falsehood.
Thank you, sir. Looking at verse 9, Well, and I guess backing up, going from the first couple verses, is David dealing with warfare? Yeah. It even says war in there. So that's pretty, that one kind of jumps out at you. If you look down at verse 9, how does David respond to warfare?
Praising God.
Praising God. I will sing a new song to you. I will sing praises to you. Even talks about a harp of 10 strings. Not sure of the importance of that. And this is, I think, this entire psalm is the result of the praise that he heaps on God for this. So when David hits warfare, he goes immediately into praise, goes immediately into worship. So let's talk about the way he worships and what he calls out about the Lord. So what, as we've done in past several weeks on this series, let's go through, and every time we see something about the Lord, what we learn from it, call it out, and we'll put it up on the board. So where's the first time we see the Lord in Psalm 144, verses 1 through 11?
Verse 1.
What does it say about the Lord in verse 1?
Lord is his rock.
David's rock.
Trains him for war.
Trains David for war.
He is a steadfast love and fortress. Verse 2.
In verse 2? Yeah, this is in verse 2, it basically gives a list of all the things that he is to David. So let's list them out.
It says loving kindness,
Loving kindness,
fortress,
fortress,
stronghold,
stronghold,
deliverer,
deliverer,
and shield.
and shield. Now, out of this list we're given in verse 2, and was that everything? Yes.
His refuge.
Oh yeah, you're right. I didn't put that in there. Thanks, Brandon. Refuge. So out of these, how many of these are these things that God is to David? How many of these have kind of a military connotation to them?
Well, all
Shield.
the
Depends
first.
on how you take the first one.
I would agree with that. This one you could
use it in war.
you could use it more, and it tends to be also something you can use outside of war. But a fortress, a stronghold, being delivered, a shield, a refuge, those tend to be more specifically geared towards times of warfare. So these are some of the character traits that right off the gate, David is calling out about God. So let's move on. Verse 3. Do we see anything in there about God?
Just asking him. He's asking him a question.
He's asking him a question. And what's the question?
Man.
What is man? And or that you take knowledge of him, or the Son of Man that you think of him. So in this, again, David is asking a question, but through that question, what is he calling out and illustrating about God?
God is knowledge.
God is knowledge.
That he's not man.
Well,
That he cares for man.
Yes.
Heart,
Yes.
significance.
Yes,
Yeah.
that he cares about lowly man. Based on this, do you think that there's something so inherently awesome about mankind, about human beings in general, that we are worthy of being taken into consideration?
No.
No. does God do so anyways?
Yes.
He does.
David talks about in a lot of his psalms throughout. There's a lot of what is man, like
Yes.
you who have like hung the stars.
Yes. Yes. Done all these wonderful things, have all these wonderful creation, and you care about us. And that's something that he just seems to really like to harp upon in his Psalms. See what I did there? Okay, so that's verse 3. What's the next time we see a character trait of God pointed out?
In verse 5, the heavens are his.
Yes. And starting in verse 5, we see 5 going through verse 7. Again, we see David imploring God to do specific things. So what are those things that he is implored to do?
Bow the heaven.
Bow the heavens. Is that verse 5? What else is he asked to do?
Touching the mountains.
What was that?
Touching the mountains.
Touch the mountains. Is that also verse 5?
Yep. Verse 6, flash the lightning and send out the arrows.
Flash lightning and send arrows. There's a DC Comics reference in there somewhere.
Only Corbin.
No, I think Derek got it. Yeah, we've got ESPN. Implored to send out lightning and arrows. What's he implored to do in verse 7?
Stretch forth his hand.
Stretch forth hand. I'm just going to say reach out.
And he rescues and delivers.
Rescue David. Okay, and oops, wait, that was verse 8. It's verse 7. Okay, so after that, what do we see about God at the end of that passage? Anything else?
He gives victory to kings and rescues David.
Gives victory to kings.
Verse 10.
Thank you. And rescues David. Okay. So based on this, we're seeing that David's in a time of warfare, or at least that a time of warfare is coming or is anticipated to come, something like that. And David is reacting to this by, again, worshiping. And what does he say in this worship? He's talking about the Lord. And starting in that first passage, that verses 1 through 4, we see several things that are really brought out about God. First off, is God just kind of leaving David to flap in the wind? My dad is former military. He was in the Air Force for 22 years, and he's got a lot of interesting thoughts on leadership. Some of the guys in the room have heard some of these thoughts. But one thing that he's always talked about, and my dad is someone who was never in a battle, never in a fight, but it was something that he was having to constantly prepare for. And the type of leader that he hated the most, and this is common pretty much throughout all military, is a leader who isn't willing to be down in the dirt with their followers and getting them ready, making sure they're good to go, and taking care of their men. And in this is God isn't leaving David to flap in the wind. He's training David. Training often isn't fun. Has anyone here ever played sports at any time in their life? Never? Watched it? Anything? Practice is usually the least fun part. You don't enjoy it. But game day comes, and very often practice is what makes the difference. It can make a difference even against talent. And that's what we've got going here for God, or that the Lord is doing for God. What are these other traits that David is calling out about God? We talked about them and how they have some pretty significant wartime references here. In looking at that list, what's kind of the theme of that list?
The list from verse 2.
Yes, sorry. I'm pointing, but it's verse 2. What?
God's protection.
Yes, his protection.
I have another version that says for loving kindness, it says loving ally, which is
Wow.
character.
That is a military term. You know, for millennia, for thousands of years, warfare was pretty consistent. Firearms were invented, and that really changed the name of the game. Then so is aircraft. But you kind of had two different types of war. You could either have two armies meeting in the middle of the field and just butting heads against one another. And the army that had the most, the manliest, best prepared, whatever, would be the ones that killed the most, and they were the victors. There was another type of warfare, and that was siege warfare. Going out and going head-to-head was dangerous. I mean, you're on the front line with your buddies. There's a guy across from you, and he's got buddies, and they're both trying to kill you. And they're going to have a chance to kill you, and you're going to have a chance to kill them. But in this instance, David is praising God for not sending him into something like that. He's in a fortress. He's in a stronghold. He has a good shield. The Lord is someone he's taken refuge in. And as a result, there's a connection here. We've got a loving ally who's going to deliver us. I mean, this is like Lord of the Rings when there's a siege and all is hopeless. The next thing you know, the Riders of Rohan show up. The allies break the siege. They relieve their friends, and victory is achieved. And this is the loving ally and the deliverer, and I love that translation. I had not seen that when I was preparing. But God also cares about lowly man. This is something that seems to startle and delight David. We've got a God who's willing to train us for war, to keep us safe even in the midst of war. And in the end, David calls all these out, and then he makes some specific requests. And again, these are kind of, you could probably call them poetic type requests. I don't know that David really wants mountains to literally explode at the touch of the Lord. But you think it's fair to say that he is calling David is calling the Lord to intervene. To really step down into the middle of the battle, fight on their behalf, and win them. And as a result, what is the outcome of this? In verse 10. David is rescued. And kings are given victory. So that's what the Lord does for us. Let's talk a little bit about, in Psalm 91, about how we are to... These are the truths that David has called out. This is what David is worshiping the Lord for. Now what are we supposed to do with it? Would somebody mind reading Psalm chapter 91?
The whole thing.
Yes.
He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only look with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked, because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge. No evil shall be allowed to befall you, no plague under your tent. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hand they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. Because he holds fast to me in love, I will deliver him. I will protect him because he knows my name. When he calls to me, I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation.
All right, thank you. So this is something that we've got the psalmist. We're not sure that this is David, so I don't know why I wrote that up there. But you've got a psalmist who is facing a time of war, and this chronicles his reaction to it, and it also lays out a groundwork for how we, as believers, should respond to warfare. So let's go through and let's talk about all the references in here to the person who's in the midst of this warfare. Sometimes that is a he or a man. Sometimes that's a you. Sometimes that's an I. But let's walk through this. And so, for instance, in verse 1, it says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty." If you're standing in someone's shadow, how close are you to that person?
Depends on what time of day it is.
This is true. But generally speaking, regardless of the time of the day, that's very close. Yeah, very close. Very close. Right on it. Too close. So you've got someone who is going back to that, up to the earlier psalm. We've got God who's going to kind of show up and save the day all by his lonesome. And the psalmist, or excuse me, we're basically called to abide in the shadow of the Almighty. Get close to that guy. He's going to win this thing. What else are we seeing about the godly man in this passage? What's the next thing we see said about him?
Trust God.
Trust God. Is that verse 2? Does verse 2 say anything about some of the things that God provides to him?
Refuge and safety.
Refuge and safety. Is this sounding familiar? A little bit, maybe? All right, what else are we seeing?
You'll be delivered from the snare of the fowler, the deadly pestilence in verse 3.
Verse 3. Delivered from snare and pestilence. Does anyone have a different word for either snare or pestilence?
He will rescue you from every trap and protect you from deadly disease.
Deadly disease. It's a pretty good definition of pestilence. What else are we seeing about the believer?
He'll be covered and find refuge.
Covered and find refuge.
His faithfulness as a shield.
What verse is that?
Verse 4.
Faithfulness, shield.
Speak great speech.
What's a good speech?
I was just thinking, it's like a great speech to give an army, like Braveheart.
Yeah. Right before you charge the enemy.
Yeah.
Will not fear.
Will not fear. I think that's kind of the point of this. Do not fear. The battle is won. All right. In verse 5, I think somebody said, will not fear.
Yeah.
And there's kind of a list. What will the believer not fear?
Yeah.
Death.
Terror of night.
Terrors of the night, the arrows that fly in the day. Disease,
Arrows. Disease.
disaster,
Disaster.
even though thousands may fall, evil will not touch you.
Evil will not touch. I've always loved that verse, by the way. One of the reasons I chose it. Evil will not touch. Okay, so that gets us through verse 7. What else are we seeing about the believer in this?
Look only with his eyes and see the recompenses with it.
Is that verse 8?
Yes.
Does anyone have a different word other than recompense?
Just open your eyes and see how the wicked are punished.
Thank you.
No,
About any version.
you appreciate it. Recompense, the last part of this verse shares the same root as compensation, which is you're being paid for something. If it's recompensation, essentially, you're being paid in kind. So what you've done, you'll get it back exactly as it had happened to you. Basically, evil rebounds back on the evildoer. That's verse 8. Anything in verse 9?
The Lord is his refuge.
Lord is his refuge. Anything in verse 10?
No evil will befall him.
Now evil will befall,
No plague.
and no plague. All right, that's verse 10. What else?
11. His angels will guard you.
Okay, what else?
It's really 11 to 13. The angels are going to guard him. And it talks about the ways the angels will guard him.
Yeah.
Bear you up and assist you basically in treading the lion and the serpent.
So are we talking about spiritual dangers, physical dangers, both? All right, what else? That gets us through verse 13.
The Lord knows his name. Delivers him.
Does it say why he will deliver him?
That he holds him.
Okay, anything else?
Verse 15, the Lord will answer him.
Lord will answer.
In trouble, and rescue and honor him.
Okay, if the Lord's answering, what has the believer done?
Call.
Called on him. And, okay. And it also, does it say anything about, yes. Rescue. I think Derek did say that, I just missed it. All right, last thing, verse 16. What's going to happen for the believer?
Of long life and salvation.
Long life and salvation. Okay, that was a lot. That is Psalm 91. So going back here, you see all the things all the qualities, character traits that David calls out about the Lord. And to distill it down into one question, is the battle in doubt ever? No. Why? Is it because there's a bunch of big hulking engineers in the front line that are going to win this thing? Or is it because there's another champion there that's going to win this on the behalf of the believers? The second option, yes. Thank you. Yes. A battle is a dangerous thing. And the psalmist is not making light of that. The enemy is terrible. The enemy is coming after us. We're in danger. But at the same time, we're protected. And then we go over here to Psalms 91. And again, we don't know who explicitly penned this one. But this individual is making some similar observations about God that the psalmist in 144 made. God is the refuge. God shelters the believer. The Lord will deliver. And as a result, what is the psalmist saying about the believer? How are they to react? And starting in verse 5.
To not fear.
To not fear. And what are we not to fear? This is a pretty comprehensive list. This is like a list of the worst things that could happen to you. And we're not...
And everything before it.
Death and everything before it. Death and worse. And we're not to fear it. Why not fear it? Is it because they're not dangerous?
Not your battle.
Because the battle's already been decided.
The battle's already been decided, essentially. I had great uncles who were stationed in the Pacific Theater during World War II, and they spent months stressing about having to launch a big D-Day style invasion of the Japanese home islands. That never came because the war was won before that point. It's not that wouldn't have been dangerous, it's just that it never came to that. And I think that's kind of what the psalmist is calling out here. What do we see is going to happen to those who are inflicting spiritual warfare upon us?
They're going to get their punishment.
They're going to get their punishment. They're going to get their recompense. It's going to come back on them. So, of all the things that we see them trying to do, death, terror, arrows, disease, disaster, evil, we see in verse 10 what's going to be the outcome of all that they inflict. Nothing. It's not going to have an impact. And we've got angels guarding us, and going on, the final outcome, as we've been saying the whole time, is the Lord delivers. So, we've got a God who's going to deliver us. We've got victory is certain. We've got immunity from defeat. That being said, are we going to, in every situation of spiritual warfare, has every believer since the beginning of time been able to escape death? No. In fact, within a very short time period following Jesus' death, the book of Acts records that Stephen, a believer, was stoned to death. So this isn't basically saying we're Superman who can survive great falls, jump tall buildings, deflect bullets if they're fired by an evil person. But what is it saying? Not that no harm will ever befall you, but what is certain? God will deliver, and so is victory. So what's the practical application of this? I don't think we're called to, even in verses 11 and to 13, is that right? Hang on. saying that he will give his angels charges concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will bear you up in their hands, that you do not strike your foot against a stone. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Does that passage come up in another part of Scripture?
Satan quotes it to Jesus.
Satan quotes it to Jesus. Where were they standing when this happened? I think it was actually on the top of the temple, wasn't it? And Satan triple dog dares Jesus to jump off the top of that spike, or off the top of that point. Does Jesus do so? Why not?
It's not right to test his Father.
Yes, do not put the Lord your God to the test. So, if we're going to be saved from plague, pestilence, deadly disease, should we walk down through the hospital ward full of people with really infectious diseases, with no masks, no anything, just because we're not going to be affected by it? No. But what should we do? We are going to face spiritual warfare. We are going to face death. We may be killed for it. We may have horrible things happen to us. But the thing we are assured is victory. So in Psalm 91, we're told to essentially walk like a victor. Don't fear. Do not walk with fear. You've got a God who's going to come in, who's going to win this battle, who's going to save the day. And even in the situations where we face death and we die or we have bad things happen to us, the victory is still assured. And as a result, so is the war, and so is our deliverance, even if it's not a strictly speaking physical deliverance. So that being said, would somebody like to close us in prayer?